Hi, girlies! Welcome to the very first episode of True Crime for the Girls. I am your host, nylazaria. For our very first episode, we will be covering the Springfield Three case. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the case, girlies. On June 7th, 1992, the Springfield, Missouri Police Department was notified about the disappearance of three women. Those three women were Sherrill Levitt, 47, who was born on November 1st, making her a Scorpio. She had brown eyes with short, bleach blonde, natural curly hair. She had a thin build and freckles on her neck and upper chest. The next woman was Suzy Streeter, 19 years old, who was Sherrill's daughter. She was born on March 9th, making her a Pisces. She had brown eyes with shoulder-length straight bleach blonde hair. She also had a scar on her forearm and a small tumor in the left corner of her mouth. The next woman was Stacy McCall, 18, Suzy's friend. Stacy was a white female with dark blonde hair. She was born on April 23rd, making her a Taurus. June 6th was the day of the disappearance. Sherrill was a hairstylist living in Springfield, Missouri. On the night of June 6th, Sherrill was seen painting a chest of drawers and talking on a phone to a friend. Sherrill Levitt was last heard from at approximately 11:15 p.m. on June 6, 1992. Suzy and her friend Stacy had just graduated from Kickapoo High School. That night of June 6, 1992, Suzy and Stacy went to a party to celebrate their graduation with their other friends. After the party, Suzy and Stacy returned to Suzy's house for a sleepover. Both Suzy and Stacy were supposed to meet up with their friends the next morning to go to a water park to continue celebrating their graduation. However, the original plan was for Suzy and Stacy to sleep over Janelle Kirby's house, then wake up and head to the water park all together. Janelle Kirby was another friend and classmate of Suzy and Stacy who was celebrating her graduation. However, due to it being literally graduation night, Janelle had tons of friends and family staying at her house. So, Suzy and Stacy just decided to go to Suzy's house for a sleepover and then meet up with Janelle at her house in the morning. Unfortunately, Suzy and Stacy never showed up to Janelle's house that next morning. Suzy Streeter and Stacy McCall were last seen at approximately 2:15 on June 7, 1992. The three women, Sherrill, Suzy, and Stacy, were never seen again. On June 7, 1992, Suzy and Stacy's friend Janelle and her boyfriend went to Suzy's house to check on them, since, they never showed up for the water park. So, Janelle just assumed that they overslept and went to their house to pick them up. However, when Janelle and her boyfriend arrived at Suzy's house, the cars of Suzy, Sherrill, and Stacy were all outside, so they figured, they're just inside, and they went to the house. When they went up to the house, they noticed that the porch light was smashed, which they thought was kind of strange, but didn't think too much of it. There was a broom leaned to the side on the porch, so the pair just swept up the glass and tossed it, basically unintentionally sweeping up evidence. The door to the home was unlocked. Since it was 1992, it wasn't odd to leave the front door unlocked. It would be insane in 2025 to leave our doors unlocked, but, it was a different time. So when Janelle and her boyfriend went into the house, Cinnamon, the family dog, ran up to them. She seemed anxious and stressed out. Then the home phone rang while they were inside, and so they answered it. And apparently on the other line, there was a young man who was making sexual comments or sexual innuendos. And so Janelle and her boyfriend just assumed that this was some sort of prank call, and they hung up the phone. They left the house, but weren't overly concerned about their friends. Then once more time passed and Stacy's mother hadn't heard from her, it became more evident that something was wrong. Once at the home, Janice was extremely concerned and called the police to report the 3 women missing. However, police didn't follow up about the disappearance until the next day, so June 8th. This is always so frustrating when I hear this in true crime cases. Janice's daughter Stacy was literally missing and she still is to this day in 2025. So why wasn't her disappearance and the other 2 women's disappearance made a priority by law enforcement? So, due to the lack of timely follow-up, many people had entered the home of Sherrill and Suzy in hopes of locating them. Again, unintentionally ruining evidence that may have been crucial to solving this case. The Springfield, Missouri Police Department launched an investigation. However, there were not many leads. The women had no history of running away. Their personal items, such as their money, cars, keys, and even the family dog Cinnamon, were all left behind, suggesting that the 3 women left abruptly. But why? Why did they leave? Where did they go? What happened to Sherrill, Suzy, and Stacy? On June 9th, 1992, the FBI joined the investigation, and volunteers and law enforcement conducted searches of the remote and wooded areas in Springfield, Missouri, trying to locate the 3 missing women. However, nothing was found. When investigators went to Sherrill and Suzy's house, they noticed that the phone line was cut. However, it was not clear if that was done before or after the disappearance of the women. Remember that weird prank call that I said Janelle and her boyfriend heard? This call confuses me because in some reports of this crime, it basically says that the phone lines have been cut. However, if the phone lines were cut, how could Janelle and her boyfriend have received a call? Also, another thing I want to point out is the fact that based on the evidence that was found, it seems like all 3 of the women made it into bed. Investigators found washcloths that had makeup on them in the bathroom, suggesting that Suzy and Stacy both took off their makeup in preparation for bed. So the women came home, took off their makeup, and then they disappeared? Did they fall asleep? Other evidence found in Sherrill's room suggests that she was reading in bed and then disappeared. An open book was found turned face down next to her reading glasses on her nightstand. So did the perpetrator enter the home while the 3 women were asleep and force them to leave? Basically kidnapping them? Lastly, all 3 women's purses were found in Suzy's room, which I found really weird. Like, it makes sense for the 2 purses to be found in Suzy's room. I'm assuming that since Stacy is staying the night with Suzy, both of their purses and other belongings would be in Suzy's room. But why would Sherrill's purse be in Suzy's room? Since this is a cold case and no one has come forward with any information regarding the disappearance of the 3 women, there have been many theories and speculations. One theory is that Sherrill was the target of the crime. Investigators have speculated that Sherrill's ex-boyfriend or someone she may have known was responsible for the disappearance of the 3 women. If someone that Sherrill knew had something to do with this crime, what would be the motive for basically kidnapping 3 women? Another theory is that the 3 women just ran away. As mentioned, people just assumed that the women disappeared voluntarily due to the fact that there had been absolutely no real signs of the women. However, in my opinion, this doesn't seem realistic. The women didn't even take their belongings. If I was to disappear voluntarily, I would definitely take my purse and my dog. There was no evidence of the women planning to leave and start a new life. And remember, Stacy wasn't even part of the family. Why would Stacy voluntarily go start a new life with her friend and her friend's mom? It just doesn't make sense to me. Another theory is that the crime was random. At the time, there had been a suspected serial killer in the area that was killing and kidnapping women in Springfield. So, investigators considered that the disappearance could have something to do with that serial killer, Robert Cox. Investigators assumed that the serial killer, Robert Cox, was driving around Springfield just looking for a victim. He probably saw Suzy and Stacy in their cars pulling into Suzy's house and decided to prey on the two women. Apparently, Suzy drove a red car that had a vanity plate that said Sweeter, spelled Sweeter. And this may have been what attracted the quote-unquote criminal to the women. I found this interesting because I have heard that vanity license plates typically draw more attention to the driver compared to like a regular license plate. I was actually thinking about getting an angel number vanity plate for my car, like a vanity plate that said like 777 or 444, but now I'm definitely reconsidering that idea. Here's another theory that actually makes sense and I think is worth looking into. The man in the van theory. A witness came forward saying that on June 7, 1992, around 6:30 a.m., she saw Suzy driving a van at like a gas station, and while at this gas station, Suzy got out of the van and she looked very distressed, and she was taking orders from a man in the back seat of the van. However, the witness didn't see Sherrill or Stacy, only Suzy. So, going back to what I said earlier, did the man in the van essentially walk into Sherrill and Suzy's house and kidnap them while they were asleep? This is just a theory, however, nothing substantial was found based on this witness statement. The last theory that I want to point out is the theory that Bart Streeter had something to do with the disappearance of the three women. As you can tell from the last name, Streeter, Bart Streeter is the brother of Suzy and the son of Sherrill. Although Bart was estranged from his mother and sister, he fully cooperated with investigators. Bart's alibi was that he got super drunk on the night of June 6, 1992, and passed out. Bart participated in a lie detector test, and he passed, which, in my mind, lie detector tests aren't that reliable. However, there has been no evidence that Bart was involved in this. Over the years, the Springfield Three case has been re-examined by local law enforcement and private investigators. However, unfortunately, no definitive evidence has been found. As of 2025, the Springfield Three case is still open and unsolved. Sherrill, Suzy, and Stacy are still listed as missing persons. However, in 1997, Sherrill and Suzy were legally declared dead even though their bodies were never found. In 2022, there was a vigil held in Victims Memorial Garden on Tuesday, June 7th to remember the three women and mark 30 years since the disappearance. This is one of those cases that really makes me think. What would make three women randomly disappear? If you have any information about the disappearance of Sherrill, Suzy, or Stacy, please contact the Springfield Police Department or Crime Stoppers at 417-869-8477. Thank you all for listening to the very first episode of True Crime for the Girls. So, girlies, what do you think happened to Sherrill, Stacy, and Suzy? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider subscribing and sharing this episode. Also, consider following True Crime for the Girls on Instagram to stay in touch. I hope all of you have a wonderful week. Bye, girlies!